So, this video I will talk about one of the most important things at the core of it all, inflation. This word and its meaning became the antagonist of my journey to financial stability. But it also seems to be a phenomenon that most people and even media rarely get right. So I could tell you about examples in history of what typically happened to the big empires suffering inflation, leading to hyperinflation and even the fall of the empire, which I might also do later on. But first I will start again by taking you back to some recent events and give a little explanation to what inflation actually is. In early 2020, as an emergency response to the pandemic, massive amounts of money were printed by the central banks. This was of course intended to boost the economy during COVID. And when I say printed, I don't mean all of it was printed physically. I'm talking about broad money aggregates. However, the enormous amounts of fiat currency being pumped into the economy means that the savings and salaries we have will decrease in value over time. Over time, if money grows faster than goods and productivity, each unit of money represents a slightly smaller claim on real things. You will need more of those same dollars to buy that same bread. Therefore, as a consequence, prices will go up, gradually at first and sometimes accelerating rapidly in the end. As you can see on the parchment, the US and the EU money supply increased from 50 trillion in 2020 to 21.8 trillion in 2023, which is an increase of 42%. And I'm just talking about the first 3 years since the pandemic. In the EU, 13.4 trillion went to 16.6 trillion. That's a 24% in money supply increase. Still elevated in 2026, because if you look at all the money being printed since 2020 to 2026, you'll see that the US dollar went from 15 trillion to 22.4 trillion, which is an increase of 49%, and the EU, the euro, went from 13.4 trillion to 17.2 trillion, which is a 28% increase in money supply. As some of you might remember, the consequence of this was that the inflation number started to rise to levels that at least I have never seen or experienced before in my entire life. At least in my country, by the beginning of 2022, the official inflation number was already between 6-7%. I mention this time frame particularly because it was right before Russia invaded Ukraine. I remember that for a long time the media has been pointing at the war and high energy prices for the cause of the high inflation that followed from 2022 on. But I want to remind you all that the inflation was already gradually climbing up toward 5 to 10% around the world, and an inflation rate of 10% means that prices will double in roughly 7 years. So summarized, then when Russia invaded Ukraine, energy markets became chaotic. Because the energy markets became so distorted, the calculation method was adjusted to better reflect contract realities. But regardless of how we measured it, prices stayed high. So here's the thing about the official inflation number and how it's being calculated. And now we get to the most important point of my video, what inflation really is. In modern economics, inflation is defined as a general rise in price level. But historically, the word inflation referred to something else, the inflation of the money supply itself. Prices don't rise on their own, something causes them to rise. One persistent cause is when the supply of money grows faster than goods and services. Short-term price spikes can come from wars, energy shocks, supply chain issues, that kind of stuff. Sustained economy-wide inflation typically requires either prolonged monetary expansion or persistent demand exceeding supply. So most people define inflation as rising prices. And technically, That's correct. But historically, inflation referred to the inflation of the money supply itself. It's even in the word itself. Inflation means inflating, getting bigger, like Aunt March in Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban. When more money is created without a matching increase in goods and services, each unit of money represents a smaller claim on real things. That doesn't always show up immediately, but over time it erodes purchasing power. And that is why my personal understanding of inflation is that at its core, it's an increase of money in circulation. It is the persistent contributing factor for the rise in prices, especially over the past years. A bigger money supply than goods and productivity. Now, without getting into speculative areas too much, I do want to add that in my personal opinion, the methods and variables used to calculate the official inflation rate are somewhat questionable. House purchase prices are largely excluded from consumer inflation measures because they're treated as assets rather than consumption. Rent is included, but the rapid rise in housing asset prices over the past years isn't fully captured in the headline inflation number. But for many households, housing is the largest financial reality. So personally, I always estimated the actual inflation numbers to be a little bit higher than the official reported numbers. And looking back to my previous video, where I concluded that by official numbers, the euro lost 30% of its purchasing power over the past 6 years, during the same years that broad money expanded roughly 28% in the euro area, we experienced nearly 30% loss in purchasing power. Some of the prices that impact our daily lives the most, energy, housing, groceries, surged dramatically. It's not surprising that purchasing power eroded during a period of rapid monetary expansion and economic disruption. To lose 30% of your purchasing power in just 6 years, you only need about 6% inflation per year. Compounding does the rest. And this compounding thingy can become something really tricky, especially when inflation numbers are staying high and not going down for a long time. Then that can result into something even worse than inflation. Hyperinflation. For this, I will have to briefly take you on a history lesson. There are many examples in history of emperors, kings, or people in power that follow the same or similar patterns that led to the debasement of their currency, the demise of their monetary system, which in return contributed to the downfall of their empire. The Roman Republic used the silver denarius, which had fairly high purity of 95 to 98% silver, which was stable for centuries. The early Roman Empire, from Emperor Augustus on into the 2nd century, they had the gold aureus, the silver denarius, and bronze coins for small change. But emperors occasionally shaved their silver content during fiscal stress, like wars, expansion, military pay. So, in the 3rd century crisis from 235 to 284 AD, what happened is that the silver denarius was gradually debased. From 90% silver to 50% to 20% and eventually to less than 5% silver. At some point it was basically a bronze coin with a thin silver wash. People were technically still holding silver coins, but the intrinsic metal value had collapsed. The coin still said silver, it just wasn't. Sound familiar? Debasement doesn't destroy an empire overnight. It erodes trust slowly. There are examples, however, of this erosion on steroids. In 1923, Weimar Germany experienced one of the most extreme hyperinflations in modern history. After World War I, Germany was burdened with heavy debts and reparations. When France occupied the Ruhr in 1923, the German government encouraged workers to strike in protest and paid them anyway. With tax revenues collapsing and deficits soaring, the state financed its spending by printing money. The result was catastrophic. A loaf of bread that cost a few hundred marks at the beginning of 1923 cost billions by the end. Savings evaporated, the currency collapsed, and trust in the young republic was deeply shaken. So, Weimar Germany is a good example of hyperinflation. But hyperinflation isn't just history. In the late 2000s, Zimbabwe experienced one of the worst hyperinflations ever recorded. Prices were doubling in a matter of days. The government eventually abandoned its currency altogether. When confidence collapses, money can disappear almost overnight. So, Rome debased silver, Weimar printed paper into oblivion, Zimbabwe watched prices double in days. And then there's something else. Not hyperinflation, but something slower. I want to talk about Turkey. Turkey hasn't entered hyperinflation, but over the past 13 years, its currency has lost roughly 24% of its value per year on average against the euro. If a currency loses roughly 24% of its value every year for 13 years, over 90% of its purchasing power disappears. Not overnight, but relentlessly. I mentioned Turkey also on a personal note because I have experienced this big change in purchasing power myself. I have visited Istanbul several times over the years. During my visits in 2013 and 2014, 1 euro made 3 lira. During my most recent visits, 1 euro makes 50 lira. 5 Türk lirası. Back then, 5 lira could actually still buy you something, like a beer or a pack of cigarettes. Today, that same everyday item costs hundreds of liras, and a 5 euro lira bill is basically worthless or like small change. Going to Turkey on holidays used to be relatively cheap, as it felt like I was 3 times as rich there back in 2013. Nowadays, what we're paying for goods in Turkey is, when calculating, pretty much the same price as what we're paying here in the Netherlands, which is considered one of the most expensive countries in Europe. The only difference is that in my country, the average income is way higher. So people visiting Turkey over the past few years who expected a cheap holiday were confronted with a big disappointment, as they came back pretty much empty-handed. Inflation is complex. It's not caused by one single thing, but money growth, supply shocks, and human psychology together create powerful forces. History shows us different speeds of the same force. Debasement, inflation, hyperinflation. The mechanics change, the psychology doesn't. When money persistently grows faster than real output, purchasing power tends to adjust. Sometimes gradually, sometimes violently. In the last episode, we saw that 1 euro became 70 cents. That wasn't magic, it wasn't random. It was the result of monetary expansion, economic shocks, and compounding over time. Inflation is not a headline, it's a process. And once you see the process, you can't unsee it. I hope this doesn't all sound too gloomy or alarming to you. And if it does, good. You are now able to see the mechanics of that process, which might make you realize the importance of protecting yourself against this erosion spell. When taxation and inflation operate at the same time, the effect on purchasing power compounds. One is visible on your paycheck, the other is quieter, but both reduce what your money can actually buy. Inflation, therefore, is also called shadow tax. Not to be confused with shadow fax. That's a good fellow. It's called shadow tax because it reduces purchasing power without ever appearing on a tax bill. Whether you call it policy, necessity, or economics, the combined effect of taxation and inflation reshapes the value of your labor. And I think that deserves scrutiny. These unforgivable curses and dark arts needed to be studied in order for me to be able to protect myself against them. How I did that will be discussed in my upcoming videos, starting with the one safest haven of them all, gold and silver, my precious metals. So thanks for watching and see you on the next video. And don't forget, I'm not a fortune teller, I'm just sharing the knowledge I accumulated during my journey on my quest for fortune.